This is your PowerPoint for the PowerPoint quiz on 20th century revolutions. Russian communism. Russian Revolution. Tsar Nicholas II created the Duma, or Russian Parliament, in 1906 in order to solve anger over hunger issues. But by World War I, Nicholas had had numerous failures. He had to dissolve the Duma, and when he did that, the Russians also lost more people than the Allies in World War I. Also, there were famines in the Russian farmlands. Rebellions were led against Nicholas, and he fell, and a rise of a provisional government that was socialist took its place. Now notice carefully and be careful on this. This was not communism. What came in between was this temporary provisional government that was socialist, that was meant to eventually evolve into some form of socialist government in Russia, but not an outright communist government. I.V. Lenin and communism. I.V. Lenin followed Marxism, but he changed it slightly. In classical Marxism, the poor would rise up spontaneously on their own. Lenin noticed that the poor in Europe were not creating a spontaneous revolution, so he argued for something called the vanguard, a group of radical leaders who would educate and lead the people into revolution. At the time, the transitional government exiled him into Germany during World War I, but the German government saw an opportunity. They believed that if they could get Lenin back into Russia, Lenin could lead a revolution and possibly get Russia out of the war. This would favor Germany since they wouldn't have to fight a two-front war against France and Russia. And this is exactly what happened. Lenin was put into a sealed railroad car, he went back into Russia, and then he led a revolution of farmers against the provisional government. He promised them land, bread, and peace. By the end of this, I.V. Lenin was able to raise enough farmers that they had a successful revolution against the provisional government. Russian isolation and messianism. Lenin got Russia to leave World War I, calling it a capitalist-imperialist war. Lenin said that Russia would not pay back any of its debts to the capitalist West because these countries had exploited Russia. The United States, France, Great Britain, and Japan all provided troops to support the Tsar's White Army in order to fight against the Red Army. Lenin believed that Russia needed time to develop before becoming a world leader, so he isolated Russia, defeated the White Army during the Civil War, and eventually looked, in the long run, to establish communism in Russia on its own. The new economic plan. Lenin saw that communism was not working out as well as he had hoped, so Lenin decided to nationalize the economy and seize grain supplies. But he was flexible. When the economy was not growing, he allowed for limited economic competition and profit incentives under the New Economic Program, or NEP. He also believed in women's freedom and sexual liberation. The rise of Joseph Stalin. Lenin eventually suffered from fatigue, 3 strokes, and recovered from a failed assassination attempt. As he was about to die, he had 3 choices for the next leader. First, he could choose Leon Trotsky, who was a military leader, charismatic, and advocated for collectivization. Collectivization was a process by which farmers would work together on common land, they would produce crops, this would be sold out on the common market, and then the government would collect the profit from this in order to invest in industrialization. Next up was Nikolai Bukharin. Bukharin was a political leader, and he advocated for cooperatives. In a cooperative, it works similar to collectivization, but farmers would be able to keep their property as private property. They would work together and share produce. The government would tax them by selling some of their produce on the common market and using the money then to invest in industrialization. But it would be slower, and there would be a smaller share of government taxes. Bukharin believed that by doing this, they would end up respecting traditional farmers and allowing for industrialization over the long run. And last up was Joseph Stalin. Stalin was a party leader, he was charismatic, and he was known for strong and defiant leadership. Notice that Joseph Stalin really didn't have a program on his own. He was going to steal the ideas of his opponents in order to gain power. The rise of Joseph Stalin. Stalin's aides intercepted a letter from Lenin warning the party against Stalin. So Stalin began placing his followers in the media and the Communist Party. He also isolated Nikolai Bukharin by calling Trotsky a traitor and having him exiled. He then stole Trotsky's idea of collectivization and claimed that Nikolai Bukharin was actually the traitor. Now, how does that isolate Nikolai Bukharin? Well, before, Nikolai Bukharin could have allied with Trotsky against Stalin, but by Stalin getting rid of Trotsky and then claiming all Trotsky's ideas to his own, Nikolai Bukharin had no allies. Collectivization versus cooperatives. As we talked about before, but to put it into more depth, collectivization is basically when the government would put farmers on a common land. Government would take a high percentage of farmers' goods in taxes. They would then sell all of these goods on the international market and use that money to rapidly industrialize. Cooperatives. The government would have farmers voluntarily join together on common land while retaining some private property. The same process would happen as above, but at less taxation over a longer time frame. Notice what Stalin was doing. Stalin stole Trotsky's ideas. Although at first he claimed that Trotsky was the traitor and that collectivization was a bad idea, Stalin eventually claimed this idea for his own, and then claimed that the idea of cooperatives that Nikolai Bukharin believed in was a capitalist idea, and that this idea was a traitor to the communist revolution. This allowed him to attack Nikolai Bukharin and all of his followers. Collectivization. Russia was largely a peasant farming country, largely due to the lack of reform of the serf system during the medieval ages. Stalin forced these farmers onto common land and then took most of their crops and taxes. The crops were sold on the international market, and the government used the profits to industrialize. The idea, again, was rapid industrialization would attract younger farmers into urban centers. Purges and abuses. The Ukrainian farmers, known as the kulaks, opposed Stalin's collectivization. So Stalin sent his secret troops to the Ukraine, and they took crops straight out of the home. He then cut off the Ukraine from outside world trade by blockading the roads. This was done in the dead of winter, and so by the time he was done, between the purges and the abuses that he did against his political opponents and against the people in the Ukraine, 40 million people were killed in man-made famines. He also placed many of his political opponents on trial and killed them or sent them to prison camps in Siberia, called the gulags. Nikita Khruschev. In 1953, Stalin died, and he was replaced by Georgy Malenkov. Malenkov only remained in power for about 1 year, and he was replaced after a year by Nikita Khruschev. Khrushchev surprisingly went in front of the Communist Duma, or Communist Parliament, and denounced Stalin as being a murderer. His attempt here was to loosen some of the central controls over the economy. The inability to reform. However, while Khrushchev was attempting to reform the economy, this created ripple effects. Hungary tried to break away from the Russian Empire. Khrushchev responded at that point, trying to keep the Russian Empire together, and so he sent in the Red Army. In 1961, Khrushchev also built the Berlin Wall to stop the flood of refugees from eastern into western Germany. The Communist Party leadership realized that any relaxation of rules would lead to a fall of Soviet communism, so they stopped all of these loosening of controls. Chinese communism. Sun Yat-sen. Sun Yat-sen advocated for Chinese independence in the late 1800s. He had many followers, but the two of the most important I want to mention are Mao Zedong and Chiang Kai-shek. All three of these men, Sun Yat-sen, Mao Zedong, and Chiang Kai-shek, advocated for industrialization, democracy, and socialism. However, after Sun Yat-sen died, both leaders split along very different lines. The Kuomintang. Chiang Kai-shek became a pro-Western and pro-capitalist leader after the death of Sun Yat-sen. Mao Zedong continued to radicalize, and he eventually became a communist. Chiang Kai-shek's forces attacked Mao Zedong and massacred the communists, so Mao Zedong took the followers he had left and escaped to the countryside, where he recruited peasants to his side. World War II. During World War II, Mao Zedong took the long march to the north, where many of his followers died from disease. But he was able to win over the peasants, especially when he protected them from Japanese invasion. After World War II was done, Mao was able to isolate Chiang Kai-shek into southern cities, and eventually Chiang Kai-shek was forced into exile to Taiwan. Mao's policies. Mao attempted to move China into industrialization through his own form of mass collectivization. It was known as the Great Leap Forward. He placed 10,000 Chinese farmers onto different collectivized farmlands. This led to a massive disillusionment and a horrible way of trying to orient the different types of ways of doing produce. And so we had a man-made famine. The result was starvation and death of 40 million Chinese farmers. Mao's counter-revolution. Mao's failed economic policies led to a rebellion of his advisors and followers. So Mao had to protect himself, and he did this with the Cultural Revolution. He created amongst young people what was known as the Red Guards. They went into Chinese villages, putting elders on trial for following Confucianism. They argued that the Chinese needed to move into modern ideals. But really the real reason here was to try to scapegoat traditional leaders in order to distract from what had been Mao's failed economic policies. So this allowed Mao to imprison his enemies at the governmental level while killing off any traditional rivals in the farmlands. Mao's legacy dies. Chinese communism had failed to produce industrialization and placed China in massive poverty, both within China and on an international basis. So, in 1973, Mao opened up trade to the West with the United States. But then Mao died, leading to the freeing of his political rivals, the most important being Deng Xioping. Deng Xioping was released from prison, and he led the efforts to imprison Mao's other loyal supporters who were left over. Deng Xiaoping's revolution. Deng Xiaoping realized that the path forward for China was a mixture of ideas. He changed Chinese communism to include a communist government with a capitalist economy and a Confucian culture. This combined Chinese respect for authority with open and competitive economics. However, in 1987, students in China wanted to push for more freedoms. They believed in an open culture and a socialist form of government. Deng Xiaoping forced the end to this rebellion through a military crackdown in Tiananmen Square. But when this was all done, he realized that he had to further economic industrialization if he was going to silence future critics. The Mexican Revolution. Latin American industrialization. Latin American countries in the late 1800s were attempting to industrialize and move away from farming. Their new leaders were called positivists. Positivists were leaders at the time who were not traditional religious people. In fact, instead, they were people who believed in science, modernization, and industry. They tried to have more separation from Catholic clerical authority, and they wanted more foreign investment. Mexican leadership. From 1876 to 1911, the positivist leader was Porfirio Diaz. He invited foreign investment for railroads and industrial development. This did end up benefiting the industrial elites, but not the common farmer. And when the European and American powers suffered economic recessions at a global level, investment slows, causing even more inequality within Mexico. The Mexican Revolution. Emiliano Zapata and Pancho Villa led small farmers and small businessmen in revolution. Porfirio Diaz was eventually replaced by General Victoriano Huerta. This caused a second rebellion by Emiliano Zapata. Then a new leader, General Alvaro Obregón, put down the revolution using new machine guns. And the United States also intervened because of its oil interests with General Pershing to stop Emiliano Zapata. The results. By the end of this, a new Mexican constitution was formed in 1917. It did promise civil liberties, limited Catholic leadership, and a redistribution of land. However, it also led to more foreign investment. And the biggest foreign investors tended to be new multinational companies, like the United Fruit Company. The problem with companies like this is that they would come in and buy up all the best land, hire local labor, but pay them incredibly low wages. And the money that they ended up making from profits all went back to their base company in the United States. This led to greater problems of inequality of land ownership.